A contaminated landfill, mob money, and the kids who decided to do something about it.
3 years ago, a journalism class at a New York State high school began an investigation of a local landfill. In the years that followed, their pursuit probed both the highest levels of government and the lowest levels of a landfill.
They learned a few lessons not offered in most classrooms and perhaps taught a few as well. This spring, when the class of '94 graduates from Middletown High School, they will leave behind a legacy on videotape.
1.5 years ago, when we completed our first documentary, we hoped that the problems would be taken seriously and that a full investigation would have been conducted into what happened here. But it hasn't, even though we've tried our hardest to get tape into the right hands. Our first documentary followed the investigations of Maurice Hinchey, now a United States Congressman, but a 1.5 years ago, a New York State Assemblyman and chairman of the Environmental Conservation Committee.
I think the first thing we ought to do is find out what the hell is going on here.
2 years ago, he conducted hearings into the old Wallkill landfill in the town of Wallkill, Orange County, New York.
This is a landfill that was owned by a town, and over a period of time, the people who were in the government in that town at the time conspired, in all probability, with illegal dumpers and illegal carters and certain industries to take waste from them and dump it here, and probably made a substantial amount of money in the process.
Hinchey and a growing segment of the public take seriously the first-hand accounts of former landfill operators Dutch Smith and Willie Myers, and believe that a cap is a cover-up.
But I tell you, there's thousands and thousands of tons of toxic waste in there, of anything you can name, from radioactive to hospital waste, you name it, it's in that landfill. And I know it's in there because I've buried lots of it.
With us this morning are some members of the Middletown High journalism class. 4 of the students who worked on the project: Jeff Dutemple, Trey Long, David Birmingham, and Brent Nyland, along with their teacher, Fred Isseks.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Fred, the retired landfill worker who we saw, Dutch Smith, really gave this project momentum. How did this begin?
Well, when we first started the course, my idea was to focus on school issues. But then I met a local activist named Don Terrell who told me about a long dormant toxic waste dump and mentioned that there were a couple of landfill operators who would go on videotape. Once we got that tape, we were rolling. We began covering meetings and interviewing politicians.
Jeff, were you surprised as part of the investigation that local governments that were supposed to work together were at odds with one another?
I was very surprised. I mean, growing up as a kid, I just felt like, government was there to help us. And then when I started getting involved with this, I realized that, government was just a lot of deal making and stuff going on behind closed doors.
Well, we have one example of one such encounter that happened in the summer of '92. Let's take a look at that.
I have nothing to hide, sir. There
Yes,
are no
you do.
Mr. Stone.
You
the
have
agreement,
something to
Mr.
hide.
Stone. The agreement with the sample.
We'll see.
today.
We'll see.
Get a court order and I'll honor it.
I want to look around if I don't
No,
take
sir.
samples.
You're not doing anything. You're leaving.
You're a problem.
David, you and your colleagues had to do a lot of legwork, a tremendous amount of legwork for this story. You had to go to town meetings after town meetings. After a while, did it feel like that you were becoming part of the story, or were you just covering the story?
We did spend a lot of time. We did a lot of recording, a lot of asking our own questions, a lot of our own interviews, and yeah, eventually we did become part of the story. It got to the point where politicians and journalists were approaching us, asking us what we were up to, what we had seen, and we became the story because we were the only people really out there working. And what we observed is that what we saw at the meetings and we saw in our research, and we did a lot, didn't always appear in the print media, like our local paper, the Times-Record.
Brent, you saw that there were some pretty tough things happening here, alleged mob connections and people that obviously didn't want this looked into. Were you ever afraid something would happen to you or that you all would be in danger because of what you were doing?
I myself, I haven't had any fear. My parents have stressed a little fear for me and my classmates, but nothing on my part.
Trey, tell us a little bit about these alleged mob connections with McNally brothers.
How did you learn about that? We first became aware of the mob involvement when different landfill workers would tell us that a truck from out of state full of toxic waste would show up at a dump site without a permit to dump there, and then would show up a half an hour later with a permit. And these are permits that would take perhaps 2 weeks to ordinarily attain from the town government. So it was obvious to us that something was going on wrong there. And also Mr. Hinchy had a lot to do with investigating the mob on his own.
Didn't that frighten you guys, knowing that there was a mob connection here?
Well, it didn't really surprise any of us just because we had found so many bits of information that did not fit together in a way that you would think the government ordinarily operates. And when it became clear that the mob was involved, it just sort of made us say, well, that explains a lot.
Well, so as the story goes, it was while he was state assemblyman that Maurice Hinchy was offered $250,000 as a bribe to end the investigation into the dirty dumping. But instead of accepting the bribe, the future congressman would turn evidence that would help put two solid waste moguls behind bars. He recites by heart the tainted chain of command.
No question about it. Westchester's garbage was coming over here through suburban carting and A1 compaction. It was coming over here because the Magellis had to respond to Nick Ratteni, who was his connection and his leader into the Lucchese crime family, unquestionably.
Joining us now from Washington this morning is Congressman Maurice Hinchy. Congressman, tell us about, briefly, your contacts with the Magelli brothers.
Well, if you're referring to the incidents of the bribe attempt, there was a person who appeared in my office at one time and, in effect, suggested that it would be to my advantage to end the investigation and try to make them to look good. Of course, we didn't do that. We continued the investigation, and we published reports indicating exactly what was going on here in terms of the illegal dumping that was taking place in this landfill and a number of other landfills throughout the Hudson Valley and in southeastern New York generally.
Is it safe to assume that mob money was able to buy other people's silence, do you think?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Is it safe to assume that mob money was able to buy other people's silence, do you think?
Oh, there's no question about it. We've documented a number of instances where local government officials particularly were influenced by mob money in order to allow them to come in and dump in their municipalities. Mob money was spread around very generally throughout that area.
Congressman, is this an isolated incident, or do you believe organized crime is deeply entrenched in the waste industry?
Well, organized crime is deeply entrenched in the waste industry in virtually every major metropolitan area across the country. And their involvement, of course, is changing over time. Right now, they and for the last several years, as a matter of fact, they have been seeking to become increasingly involved in aspects of incineration because they thought that that was the next generation of waste disposal techniques. And they have been very heavily involved in trying to infiltrate themselves into aspects involving the construction and use of waste incinerators in virtually every metropolitan area across the country.
Briefly, what remains the sticking point in getting an investigation into this dump and getting core samples and settling this issue?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
What remains to be the sticking point or the obstacle in resolving the issue on this dump?
Well, in this particular dump, I think that our hearings have documented that over a period of time, a substantial amount of illegal waste that was taken in from industrial sources, much of which is hazardous and, in fact, toxic, was dumped at this particular landfill. This is not an unusual situation. Many of the landfills that were operated at that particular time were experiencing the same kind of situation.
But Congressman, the bottom line I'm asking, though, is what is the problem with actually getting this situation investigated and resolved completely as to whether or not what's in there and having it cleaned up?
Well, this matter has been investigated, as a matter of fact. We brought it to the attention of law enforcement authorities, and law enforcement authorities, particularly the U.S. Attorney's Office, has investigated those carters who brought material into this waste landfill and other landfills, and there have been indictments and, in fact, criminal sentences imposed upon a number of those people.
All right. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Well, when we continue with our segment, one paper called them the Video Avengers. How did the professional media respond to the high schoolers' hot story? Stay with us.
A video documentary to inform the public, to move politicians into action, and to attract some media attention to open up the story.
It's kids that were able to make the media stay was something that affected a very large community, because there's something there. You couldn't make this stuff up. It's just too bizarre.
We've been talking about what began as a high school class project and ended with a documentary that students claim exposed corruption, conspiracy, and incompetence in their local government.
But when the Middletown High School class took their tape to the local media, they found the story they thought would set the world on fire elicited only a lukewarm response.
Back now with I-Team's Matthew Schwartz and the story of a toxic dump in Wallkill, New York.
In August of 1992, WWOR-TV, Channel 9 in Secaucus, New Jersey, ran a 7-minute story about the dump.
Understand that you have something to cover up. You don't want to see data that is...
And our only local newspaper, the Times-Herald Record, didn't want to have anything to do with the problem.
I don't really want to see your tape.
But then Robert Henley wrote a story about the Wallkill dump for the Village Voice in May 1993. Within a week, Leslie Stahl was in the Middletown High School doing an interview for 60 Minutes. Very soon after that, the Times-Herald Record ran 2 big articles and a full-page editorial about the Wallkill dump.
We might add that 60 Minutes has not scheduled a date to air their story on the efforts of this class. You guys actually went to, Trey and Jeff, you went to see the editor of the Times-Herald Record and asked him why he didn't look at the tape. You dropped it off like months in advance and he didn't even take a look at it, right? What was his explanation?
Well, actually, I went to go drop off the tape, and then a few months later he came in for an interview, and Trey and I, and along with a few others, conducted the interview. It was in the studio in the high school. And, you know, we were just talking. It started out really general about stuff about, you know, paper, and then we started getting in about what's really going on around here. And everything that we said, he said we were wrong. He said he really didn't want to see our tape, like the clip you showed. He didn't want anything to do with our story. And, you know, what we see is one of the biggest stories around our area right now. This guy didn't want to have anything to do with it when he's the editor of our virtually our only newspaper.
Are you left with a sense that you affected real change and the situation has been brought to a close? The congressman said that there had been some indictments.
Well, we still have the sense that we've got more work to do. It's an ongoing project. I'm sure we'll be going into it next year. But right now, the only plan is to put a cap over the dump, which we feel is a cover-up.
All right. Well, continued good luck with your efforts. We appreciate you joining us today, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's the news for this half hour.
Thanks for watching CBS News Up to the Minute.